I just slapped you. Really interesting.
Hey, fellas. Dalton! Don't let no one get this close.
Get out of town.
It takes a lot to get me angry, but when I am... aggressive around here.
Roadhouse 2024 is not a simple remake, but a complete reimagining of the 1989 cult classic that starred Patrick Swayze, a fact that immediately sets the stage for a very different kind of story. This analysis will explore how director Doug Liman, known for Edge of Tomorrow and Mr. and Mrs. Smith, crafted a film with a substantial $85 million budget for a direct release on Amazon Prime Video on March 21, 2024, following its premiere at South by Southwest. Unlike the original's cool, philosophical bouncer with a mysterious past, this version introduces Elwood Dalton, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, as a deeply traumatized former UFC middleweight fighter grappling with intense rage and survivor's guilt. The critical reception for Roadhouse 2024 is a fascinating study in contrasts, perfectly encapsulated by its fresh rating of 68% on Rotten Tomatoes, where the consensus notes the film happily replicates the original's emphasis on cheesy brawn over narrative brains. However, a deeper dive into audience scores reveals a divided story, with some viewers finding the film primal, bruising, ludicrous, and very fun, while others, particularly diehard fans of the original, dismiss it as mediocre slop seemingly designed for modern, shorter attention spans. This division is not a bug, but a feature of the film's very design, a conscious choice by the filmmakers to prioritize a certain kind of visceral, adrenalized experience over a beat-for-beat recreation of an 80s icon. The narrative begins by shifting the setting from a dusty Missouri roadhouse to the sun-drenched, deceptively idyllic and tourist-driven Florida Keys, a location that visually and thematically represents the thin veneer of paradise masking deep corruption. We find Dalton surviving on the fringes of society, participating in underground fights, his every move haunted by the traumatic past that ended his UFC career. He accidentally killed an opponent in the octagon. Frankie, played with pragmatic energy by Jessica Williams, is the desperate owner of a rowdy bar called the Roadhouse, and she hires Dalton, hoping his fearsome reputation will stop a gang of thugs from systematically trashing her establishment. Dalton quickly learns these thugs are not just random troublemakers, but work for Ben Brandt, played by Billy Magnuson as the spoiled, petulant son of an imprisoned crime lord who now runs the family's illicit operations with a whiny entitlement. Brandt's motivation is not complex villainy but simple greed. He wants to force Frankie out of her business, so he can bulldoze the bar and build a massive luxury resort development, injecting a modern gentrification versus local business trope into the narrative. Unlike the original film, where the villain operated with a sinister, corrupt businessman gravitas, this plot leans heavily into a more contemporary, almost bratty antagonism that mirrors modern economic anxieties. When Brandt's standard goons fail to stop Dalton's relentless efficiency, he makes a desperate call to bring in an outside wild card, an enforcer unlike any threat the beachside community has ever encountered. This wild card is Knox, played by Conor McGregor in his feature film acting debut, a feral, perpetually shirtless, psychotically grinning enforcer who treats extreme violence not just as a job, but as a euphoric party drug. Knox represents the final boss energy of the film, a chaotic force of nature who arrives unannounced and unstoppable, chewing the scenery and anything else that gets in his way. The film's plot then hurtles toward its explosive final act, which involves a stolen speedboat, a massive exploding yacht, and the ultimate showdown inside the completely trashed interior of the roadhouse itself. In a narrative twist that darkly mirrors the original film's climax, Knox turns on his employer, Brandt, snapping his neck with a casual brutality that underscores his character's complete lack of loyalty or morality. This act leaves nothing standing between Dalton and Knox but pure animalistic rage, leading to a brutal duel to the near death, where Dalton is forced to unleash the very inner monster he has been trying so hard to suppress. Dalton finally stabs Knox repeatedly in a visceral, exhausting frenzy and leaves him for dead, an act that paradoxically allows him to finally make peace with his own rage and survivor's guilt. Unlike Patrick Swayze's philosophy degree-wielding cooler, this Dalton is a fundamentally broken athlete, and Gyllenhaal, who bulked up significantly for the role, plays him as a man barely containing an internal storm of self-destruction. Critics have noted that Gyllenhaal's smile teases while his body indulges in the violence, creating a performance that is less about being a wise mentor and more about being a ticking time bomb, one that could detonate at any moment. Reviews suggest that where Swayze's performance made you want to be the hero, Gyllenhaal makes you fear the immense, soul-crushing rage required to become one in the first place. He brings a genuine, palpable sadness to the role that adds an unexpected layer of humanity to what could have been a simple action caricature, turning Dalton's physical prowess into a symptom of deep psychological scarring. The camera lingers on his haunted eyes as much as his chiseled muscles, creating a portrait of a man for whom fighting is both a punishment and a penance. Then there is Knox, played by Conor McGregor, and this character stands as the film's most gloriously divisive element, a lightning rod for both praise and ridicule. In his acting debut, the real-life UFC superstar plays a deranged hitman who fights with a primal scream, frequently entering scenes in his underwear or completely naked, embodying an ID-like lack of inhibition. On the positive side, many critics and viewers found him a real regal presence on screen, crackling with an unpredictable energy that the film desperately needs, concluding that if you liked him in the UFC, you will love him here. On the completely opposite end of the spectrum, other viewers argue vehemently that he overacts to a laughable degree and simply cannot act, describing his performance as ridiculous and a glaring sign of the film's lower artistic quality. Regardless of where one lands on this debate, Knox functions flawlessly as an agent of pure chaos who steals every single scene he is in, often by screaming incoherently at the top of his lungs before throwing a perfectly executed spinning elbow. He is not a character of depth but one of impact, and his physicality, born from a lifetime of real combat sports, brings an authenticity to the fight choreography that a trained actor could not easily replicate. The supporting cast around Dalton and Knox is given a meaningful, if streamlined, modernization, particularly the female characters who are afforded far more agency than their 1989 counterparts. Jessica Williams plays Frankie not as a damsel in distress waiting for a strong man to save her, but as a pragmatic, stressed, and fiercely determined business owner fighting for her livelihood against overwhelming odds. Her performance grounds the film's more outlandish elements in a relatable economic reality, making her bar feel like a place worth fighting for beyond just the physical brawls. Ellie, played by Daniela Melchior, is the local doctor and love interest, and her character receives a significant upgrade in agency compared to Kelly Lynch's role in the original film. She is not just a romantic prize to be won, but an active participant in the climax, especially during a pivotal scene where she physically intervenes with her corrupt father, the sheriff, to save Dalton's life. This moment transforms her from a passive observer into a crucial piece of the resolution, suggesting a screenwriting awareness that modern audiences expect a more balanced dynamic. Using aggregated data from reviews, including those on Allociné, Rotten Tomatoes, and detailed IMDb user critiques, we can surgically separate the film into its core strengths and its undeniable weaknesses. Nearly every review, whether positive or negative, agrees on one fundamental strength. The action choreography is brutal, bloody, and exceptionally well shot, utilizing director Doug Liman's kinetic style. Gyllenhaal's total commitment to the physical role ensures that every hit feels visceral and painful, moving away from the classic 80s brawling style and into something that feels authentically like modern mixed martial arts. Even the most scathing negative reviews concede that Jake Gyllenhaal gives a true, committed performance and is in absolutely peak physical form, elevating the material around him through sheer professional will. The tone is another frequently cited strength, as the film smartly refuses to take itself too seriously, understanding exactly what kind of experience it is selling to the audience. For viewers looking for a switch-your-brain-off action flick with high production values and a game cast, it succeeds brilliantly and without apology. However, the weaknesses are just as pronounced and stem largely from the film's frantic pacing and lack of narrative breathing room. A recurring complaint across user reviews is that the film rushes the process of character development, with one IMDb user noting that the relationships aren't deep enough to make any of the end results feel worth the emotional journey. The original film was leisurely enough to allow room to breathe within its world, while the 2024 version allegedly tells you what to feel rather than letting you organically feel it yourself, a distinction that makes all the difference for character investment. The villains, aside from McGregor's entertaining chaos, represent a significant downgrade in menace and memorability. Billy Magnuson's Ben Brandt is often seen as a whiny, petulant antagonist, lacking the sinister gravitas that made the original's Brad Wesley a genuinely threatening presence. Furthermore, the entire mafia and crime syndicate plot is described by some critics as a bad crime film grafted onto a bar story, focusing far too much screen time on the weakest narrative element of the original story rather than rebuilding it from the ground up. Fans of the 1989 original consistently expressed disappointment over the lack of practicality in the 2024 version, specifically missing the detailed process of cleaning up and improving the bar. In the original, watching Dalton methodically hire staff, fix the plumbing, and train bouncers provided a deeply satisfying underdog narrative of community building. In the 2024 film, Dalton solves the bar's deep-seated issues almost instantly upon arrival, removing the gradual, earned sense of progress that made the first film so rewarding and replacing it with an unearned status quo. The shadow of 1989 looms incredibly large over every frame of this film, making the differences in the heroes past a central point of discussion for the remake debate. In 1989, Dalton was simply a legendary cooler who had retired with a quiet, mysterious dignity, a professional who had reached a point of peace. In stark contrast, the 2024 Dalton is a traumatized killer who lives with crippling guilt, a man for whom violence is not a tool but a deeply embedded curse he can never fully exorcise, transforming the text of the story entirely. One of the most significant and mourned absences is the character of Wade Garrett, the iconic mentor figure played by the legendary Sam Elliott in the original film, a role that provided emotional ballast and a tragic second-act death. His entire function in the narrative's climax and Dalton's moral compass is replaced in the 2024 version by two surreal elements: a literal crocodile that serves as a recurring, almost symbolic threat in the Florida Keys waters, and Dalton's own internal, barely controlled rage that finally boils over. This substitution of an external, loving mentor with an internal, destructive monster and a reptile is the single boldest statement of the remake's thematic divergence. The ending of Roadhouse 2024 further cements this divergence from its source material, opting for a somber, ambiguous note rather than a triumphant ride into the sunset. In 1989, Dalton kills the villain, gets the girl, and drives off, leaving the audience with a sense of classical Hollywood closure and catharsis. The 2024 version sees Dalton almost die from his wounds, refuse the girl, give the money he earned to the struggling local townspeople, and then board a bus alone, leaving the Florida Keys as a solitary, wandering figure who has not solved his trauma, but merely survived another chapter of it. Furthermore, a mid-credits scene aggressively shatters any sense of finality by revealing that Knox, despite being stabbed numerous times and left for dead, is still very much alive in a hospital bed, cackling maniacally. This sets up a potential sequel with an almost Marvel-esque blockbuster sensibility, something the self-contained 1989 original never needed or contemplated. The very existence of this scene shifts the film from a standalone story into a franchise-launching vehicle, an important context for its narrative choices. Roadhouse 2024 is ultimately a film trapped between two generations, unable to fully satisfy the purists while ambitiously courting a new audience that may not care about its legacy. For the purist who worships the original, it is an unnecessary remake that squanders its potential and allegedly treats its audience like children with ADHD, with one IMDb user dismissing it with a single brutal word: slop. The soul of the 80s, the working-class camaraderie and the slow-burn mentorship, is almost entirely absent from this version. For the modern action fan with no attachment to Patrick Swayze's legacy, the film is primal, ludicrous, and very fun, a disposable but highly entertaining spectacle fueled by a magnetic lead performance. Ultimately, the film succeeds mightily and unequivocally as an action vehicle custom-built for Jake Gyllenhaal's physical and dramatic talents, but struggles profoundly as a faithful or even respectful adaptation of its source material. It updates the visuals and the fight choreography to a bleeding-edge modern standard, but arguably fails entirely to capture the ineffable cool factor, the charm, and the heart of the original. For the modern action fan with no attachment to Patrick Swayze's legacy, the film is primal, ludicrous, and very fun, a disposable but highly entertaining spectacle fueled by a magnetic lead performance. Ultimately, the film succeeds mightily and unequivocally as an action vehicle custom-built for Jake Gyllenhaal's physical and dramatic talents, but struggles profoundly as a faithful or even respectful adaptation of its source material. It updates the visuals and the fight choreography to a bleeding-edge modern standard, but arguably fails entirely to capture the ineffable cool factor, the charm, and the heart of the original. However, the cold metrics of streaming success tell a story that reviews and legacy debates cannot alter, and due to its strong viewership numbers and the blatant sequel setup in the mid-credits scene, Amazon MGM Studios is already moving forward with a sequel. This greenlight proves that even if critics are hopelessly divided and the original's fans are alienated, the Roadhouse intellectual property is now officially open for business as a modern franchise. The final aggregated verdict hovers around a 6 out of 10, marking the film as a brutal and fun mess that looks fantastic and delivers on violence, but has a noticeably hollow emotional core, making it a perfect watch for Gyllenhaal's muscles and McGregor's madness, but a deeply frustrating experience for those who still worship Swayze. Roadhouse 2024 arrives in a cinematic landscape utterly saturated with legacy sequels and nostalgic reboots, yet it makes the bold, almost defiant choice to discard the philosophical cool of Patrick Swayze's Dalton in favor of something far more fractured and contemporary. Director Doug Liman, whose filmography from Swingers to Edge of Tomorrow demonstrates a fascination with chaotic protagonists trapped in loops of their own making, finds in this material a perfect vehicle for exploring the modern crisis of masculinity through the lens of a man who literally cannot stop fighting. The decision to transform Dalton from a legendary bouncer with a mysterious past into a disgraced UFC fighter with a very public, very traumatic history fundamentally alters the entire thematic architecture of the story, shifting it from a laid-back Western about a hero who has found peace into a psychological pressure cooker about a man desperate to find any peace at all. Jake Gyllenhaal, an actor who has spent his entire career oscillating between sensitive vulnerability and explosive physicality, embodies this new conception of the character with a commitment so total that his body itself becomes a narrative text, the chiseled muscles and visible scars telling a story of punishment, survival, and deep, unresolved pain before he even speaks a single word of dialogue. The very first scenes of the film function as a masterclass in economical, visual storytelling, introducing us to Dalton not through exposition, but through the dark, grimy spectacle of underground fighting, where he stands in a circle of desperate men, his posture that of someone who is both predator and prey simultaneously. He wins his fight with a cold, almost mechanical efficiency, but the look in his eyes is not one of triumph or even grim satisfaction. It is the thousand-yard stare of a man who has seen the absolute worst of himself and cannot unsee it, a man who knows that every victory in the ring is a reminder of the one victory that cost a man his life and cost Dalton his soul. The camera lingers on these moments of stillness, the quiet between the explosions of violence, because it is in these silences, these haunted pauses, that Gyllenhaal communicates the entire inner world of the character without resorting to clunky dialogue or heavy-handed flashbacks, a testament to both his skill as a performer and Lyman's confidence as a visual storyteller. The relocation of the story from Jasper, Missouri, to the fictional Glass Key in the Florida Keys is not merely a cosmetic change or a cynical attempt to provide more attractive scenery for the streaming audience. It is a deeply considered thematic choice that supports the film's underlying commentary on class, corruption, and the hollow promises of paradise. The original Roadhouse existed in a dusty, landlocked world of working-class authenticity, where the bar was a fortress against the encroaching corruption of a single wealthy man, a classic Western frontier narrative transposed to the late 20th century. The 2024 version, by contrast, takes place in a world that is already a paradise, a sun-drenched tourist destination where the beauty of the environment itself becomes a weapon used by the wealthy to extract value from the land and the people who live on it, a far more insidious and recognizable form of modern economic violence. The Roadhouse itself, in this new iteration, is not the established, rough-hewn institution of the original, but a struggling, precarious business perched on the edge of financial ruin and literal destruction. Its very existence an act of defiance against the forces of gentrification and corporate greed that seek to pave over it. Frankie, as portrayed by Jessica Williams with a perfect blend of sardonic wit and genuine desperation, is not simply hiring a bouncer to clean up her bar. She is hiring a last line of defense, a human shield against an enemy that has already bought the police, the local government, and the very ground beneath her feet. Williams brings a grounded, relatable energy to the role, making Frankie feel like a real person caught in an impossible situation rather than a narrative device designed to motivate the hero, and her scenes with Gyllenhaal crackle with a platonic chemistry that feels far more honest and interesting than a forced romantic subplot would have been. Ben Brandt, the primary antagonist, represents a fascinatingly modern and deeply frustrating breed of villain, one who has inherited his power rather than earned it, and who treats his criminal enterprise with the petulant entitlement of a tech bro whose app has been rejected by investors. Billy Magnuson plays him with a whiny, almost pathetic edge that some viewers find underwhelming compared to the sinister gravitas of Ben Gazzara's Brad Wesley in the original. But this performance is arguably far more accurate to the actual texture of contemporary evil, which so often wears the face of a spoiled man-child who has never been told no and has the resources to make his tantrums into everyone else's problem. Brandt is not intimidating in the classical sense. He is not physically imposing or psychologically brilliant or even particularly competent at his chosen profession of organized crime. But he is dangerous precisely because his mediocrity is backed by an infrastructure of inherited wealth and inherited cruelty that can absorb any number of failures and keep coming. The narrative structure of Roadhouse, 2024, functions in many ways like a video game, with each successive wave of antagonists representing an escalating difficulty level that tests Dalton's skills, his patience, and ultimately his very will to remain a human being rather than the monster he fears he has become. The first wave of thugs are generic muscle, easily dispatched by Dalton's superior technique and psychological intimidation, and these early fight scenes serve to establish his almost supernatural competence, while also hinting at the barely suppressed fury that fuels it. The second wave involves more organized, more determined opposition, including corrupt police officers who weaponize the legal system against Dalton, forcing him to confront the reality that his fists cannot solve every problem. A lesson that the original Dalton understood innately, but that this new Dalton must learn through painful experience. It is into this escalating pattern that Knox, played by Conor McGregor, erupts like a grenade thrown into a quiet dinner party, his arrival marked by a complete and immediate tonal shift that announces to the audience that all bets are now off. McGregor, making a feature film acting debut that has been described variously as a revelation, a disaster, and everything in between, brings to the screen something that no classically trained actor could possibly replicate. The raw, unfiltered, almost alien physical charisma of a man who has made a career out of hurting people in front of millions of cheering fans. His Knox is not a character in any conventional sense. He is a force of nature, a pure ID given human form, a grinning, screaming, perpetually shirtless avatar of chaos who treats violence not as a means to an end but as an end in itself, a form of ecstatic self-expression that he has been waiting his entire life to unleash. The decision to have Knox fight Dalton while completely naked in one scene, or clad only in his underwear in others, is a choice that could easily have been played for cheap, juvenile humor, but instead becomes a strangely effective visual metaphor for his character's complete lack of inhibition, his total rejection of the social contracts and civilized masks that even the other violent men in the film still wear. When Knox tears off his clothes, he is not just preparing for a fight. He is shedding the last vestiges of humanity, revealing himself as something elemental and terrifying and, in his own deranged way, almost pure, a creature entirely unburdened by conscience, regret, or the fear of consequences that paralyzes so many others. His spinning elbows and flying knees, moves pulled directly from McGregor's own UFC highlight reel, land with a sickening, bone-crunching realism that distinguishes these fight scenes from the more balletic, choreographed violence of typical action cinema, grounding the fantasy in a body horror of actual impact. The dynamic between Dalton and Knox is the molten, radioactive core around which the entire third act of the film is constructed, and their rivalry speaks to something deeper than a simple hero versus villain conflict. Dalton is a man who has killed and been destroyed by that killing, who has spent every waking moment since that fatal night in the octagon trying to contain the violent impulses that he knows could consume him entirely, who fights now not for glory or money, but as a form of penance, a self-flagellation that he hopes will eventually earn him some measure of forgiveness from a universe that owes him nothing. Knox is a man who has never felt a moment of guilt in his life, who views the capacity for violence as the highest possible human achievement, who looks at Dalton's tortured restraint and sees not nobility but weakness, a waste of a perfectly good killing machine that he intends to either recruit or destroy. The psychological dimensions of this confrontation are rendered visually through the brilliant fight choreography and the contrasting physical languages of the two performers. Gyllenhaal, trained to move with the disciplined, technical precision of a professional fighter, delivers his strikes, blocks, and takedowns with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has turned his body into a weapon, and that weapon into a prison, every movement controlled, intentional, and carrying the weight of a terrible history. McGregor, by contrast, moves with a loose, unpredictable, almost animalistic fluidity, his attacks coming from angles that should not exist, his defense consisting of simply absorbing damage that would fell a lesser man, and responding with maniacal laughter that is more unsettling than any threat could be, his entire physical performance existing in a realm beyond technique, beyond strategy, beyond anything that Dalton's trauma-honed discipline has prepared him to face. The love story between Dalton and Ellie, a local doctor played by Daniela Melchior, represents one of the film's most significant departures from the original and one of its most thoughtful, albeit compressed, narrative threads. In the 1989 film, the romance between Dalton and Doc was important, but functioned primarily as a standard action movie love interest, a reward for the hero's bravery and a motivation for his final confrontation with the villain, complete with a damsel-in-distress moment that has not aged particularly well. Melchior's Ellie, by contrast, is introduced and developed as a fully realized human being with her own profession, her own moral compass, and her own complicated relationship with the corrupt power structures that Dalton has come to destroy, a woman whose choice to be with him is an active, conscious decision rather than a narrative default. Her father, as we discover, is the corrupt sheriff who has been enabling Brandt's criminal activities, and this revelation transforms Ellie from a passive observer of the conflict into a central player in its resolution. A woman torn between biological loyalty and moral clarity, between the father who raised her and the stranger who has shown her a different kind of integrity. The scene in which she confronts her father, holding a gun on him to prevent him from executing Dalton, is a genuine standout moment that gives Melchior the opportunity to display a range and intensity that the romantic lead in a movie called Roadhouse is not typically afforded, and she seizes that opportunity with both hands. Their romance is not a fairy tale, but a tentative, fragile connection between two damaged people who recognize something real in each other and are both too weary to pretend it is more than it is, an approach that feels authentically adult in a genre that often defaults to adolescent fantasy. The absence of Wade Garrett, the mentor figure so memorably embodied by Sam Elliott in the 1989 original, is arguably the single most painful wound that fans of the original will carry throughout their viewing experience, and it is a wound that the film does not attempt to heal so much as acknowledge through its very structure. Elliot Garrett was the soul of the original, a grizzled, warm, deeply human presence who represented the life Dalton could have if he survived his demons. A friend whose brutal murder provided the emotional stakes for the climactic revenge, and whose absence in the 2024 version leaves a hole that nothing else in the narrative can quite fill. The film makes the daring choice not to replace Garrett with a similar figure, but to distribute his narrative function across three very different, much stranger elements, each of which speaks to the darker, weirder tone of this new iteration. The first of these replacement elements is a literal crocodile, a massive Florida beast that lives in the waters near the bar and appears at several key moments, including one deliriously absurd sequence where it supposedly eats one of Brant's henchmen, though the details are left tantalizingly ambiguous. On a surface level, this crocodile is a convenient threat, a way to dispose of characters without Dalton having to bloody his hands. But on a deeper level, it functions as something far more interesting and thematically coherent. The crocodile is the untamable violence of nature itself, the Florida wilderness pushing back against the overdevelopment and corruption that Brant represents, and it serves as a mirror to the untamable violence within Dalton that he has spent the entire film trying to keep submerged, a violence that, like the crocodile, can be ignored for a time but can never truly be eliminated. The second replacement for the Wade Garrett function is the community of Glass Key itself, the collection of eccentric, struggling locals who Dalton initially keeps at arm's length, but who gradually become something like a family, albeit a family he is fated to leave behind. The bookstore owner, the other bouncers, the regulars at the bar who have watched their town slowly being sold out from under them. These are the people who give Dalton something to fight for beyond his own self-destruction. The emotional stakes that Garrett provided in a single iconic performance. The film's handling of this community is admittedly rushed, a casualty of the streaming-era pacing that prioritizes forward momentum over the kind of shaggy, novelistic digression that allowed the original to build a sense of place and belonging that made the final confrontation so satisfying. But the bones of something genuinely moving are visible beneath the compression. The third and most thematically resonant replacement for the mentor archetype is Dalton's own suppressed rage, which the film treats not as a character flaw to be overcome through discipline and wisdom, but as a separate entity living inside him. A monster that he must eventually accept and unleash if he is to survive. This internalization of the mentor role is a profoundly modern psychological move, one that speaks to a culture that has largely lost faith in the possibility of external wisdom and external salvation, leaving individuals to wrestle their demons alone in the dark. When Dalton finally, in the climax, stops fighting his rage and allows it to flow through him, the film presents this not as a defeat or a corruption, but as a necessary integration, a dark apotheosis that allows him to match Knox's psychotic freedom with a focused, controlled fury that is, in its own way, just as terrifying. The final showdown between Dalton and Knox, which takes place in the wreckage of the roadhouse itself, is a sequence of such sustained, brutal intensity that it risks becoming exhausting, which is precisely the point that Lyman and his team are trying to make. This is not a clean, heroic victory, but a messy, desperate, ugly struggle for survival between two men who have both, in their different ways, transcended the normal human limitations regarding the infliction and absorption of pain, turning the confrontation into something closer to a mutual exorcism than a fight. Dalton's eventual victory, achieved by stabbing Knox repeatedly with whatever improvised weapons he can find in the debris, leaves him not triumphant but utterly hollowed out, lying on the floor of the destroyed bar and staring at the ceiling as if waiting for death to take him, a visual echo of the octagon where his original trauma was born. It is in this moment, hovering between life and death, that the film makes its most significant thematic statement, a statement that has confused and frustrated viewers who came in expecting the moral clarity of an 80s action movie. Dalton does not rise from the wreckage as a redeemed hero, does not collect his reward and ride off into the sunset with the girl on the back of his motorcycle, does not deliver a final, pithy one-liner that sends the audience out of the theater on an adrenaline high. Instead, he quietly gives away the money he earned for his bloody work to the local bookstore, a gesture of small, anonymous kindness that asks nothing in return, and then boards a Greyhound bus alone, heading toward an uncertain future with no destination announced and no promise of healing. This ending is not a rejection of happy endings so much as a quiet insistence that some wounds do not heal, that some traumas cannot be resolved by defeating a villain or winning a fight or saving a town, that the real work of surviving yourself continues long after the credits roll. It is a somber, ambiguous, deeply adult conclusion that has been derided as anticlimactic by some viewers and praised as refreshingly honest by others. And the disagreement itself reveals the central tension that defines the entire project, the unbridgeable gap between what a Roadhouse movie is supposed to be and what this specific Roadhouse movie wants to be. The mid-credits scene that follows, showing Knox alive and cackling in a hospital bed despite the apparently fatal wounds he sustained, has been interpreted by many as a cynical franchise play, a Marvel-style sequel tease that undermines the finality of the preceding conclusion. This interpretation is not wrong, exactly, but it is also incomplete, as the scene serves a more immediate thematic purpose within the film's established logic, reinforcing the idea that the Knoxes of the world, the forces of pure, joyful chaos, cannot be permanently defeated by any act of violence, no matter how extreme or desperate. Dalton may have won the battle, but Knox's survival suggests that the war itself is eternal, that the monster outside is as difficult to kill as the monster within, and that the best anyone can hope for is to survive each encounter and keep moving. The film's treatment of violence, which numerous critics have described as excessive, gratuitous, and even unpleasant to watch, is in fact one of its most carefully considered and ethically coherent elements, designed to deny the audience the comfortable, sanitized, consequence-free violence of most blockbuster action cinema. When Dalton breaks a man's arm in an early fight, we see the aftermath, the bone protruding, the victim's screams, the sickened faces of the bystanders who realize that the violence they have paid to see is not entertainment but horror, a distinction the film insists on maintaining throughout its runtime. The camera does not look away, and because it does not look away, neither can the audience, forcing a kind of accountability for the thrills we have purchased that is rare and genuinely challenging in a mainstream streaming offering designed to be consumed casually on a Friday night. The cinematography, overseen by Henry Braham, who previously worked on Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 and The Suicide Squad, brings a comic book vibrancy to the Florida Keys that deliberately contrasts with the grim, gritty violence unfolding within it, a juxtaposition that creates a persistent sense of tonal vertigo. The sunsets are impossibly beautiful, the turquoise waters inviting and serene, the pastel architecture of Glass Key charming and whimsical. And into this paradise, the film drops acts of physical brutality that would not be out of place in a horror movie, a collision of aesthetics that mirrors the collision of worlds represented by Dalton's arrival. The effect is disorienting in a productive way, a visual reminder that violence does not only happen in dark alleys and rainy cities, but also, and perhaps especially, in places that have been designed to look like utopia. The sound design of the fight scenes deserves particular attention, as it represents a conscious and effective departure from the exaggerated, almost musical impact sounds of traditional action cinema in favor of something far more visceral and unpleasant. Bones do not crack with a satisfying pop. They crunch wetly, sickeningly, reminding the audience of the meat and calcium and living tissue that is being destroyed by the forces on screen, a choice that further distances this Roadhouse from its more cartoony predecessor. The absence of a traditional score during the most intense combat sequences, replaced by heavy breathing, grunts of pain, and the awful percussion of fists meeting flesh, removes the emotional safety net that music typically provides, leaving the viewer uncomfortably present in the moment of violence without the usual cues that tell us this is all just fun. The film's soundtrack, a mix of country, blues, and contemporary rock, does important thematic work when it is present, connecting this new, glossy version of the story to its roots in a specific American musical tradition that speaks of heartbreak, survival, and the long, hard road that gives the film its name. Live bands perform at the Roadhouse throughout the film, a carryover from the original that serves not just as atmosphere, but as a continuing assertion of the bar's identity as a place for authentic human connection and artistic expression in the face of corporate homogenization. When the music stops, when the band flees the stage because another brawl has broken out, it is a small tragedy, another piece of the community that Brandt and his forces are methodically destroying, another reason for the audience to invest in the bar's survival beyond the abstract principle of stopping the bad guys. The film's engagement with the legacy of the original is simultaneously its greatest burden and its most interesting feature, a metatextual conversation about what we owe to the past and what the past owes to the present that plays out in every frame. The screenwriters Anthony Bagarazzi and Charles Mondry clearly understood that a shot-for-shot remake would be a hollow, pointless exercise, a karaoke performance of a beloved song that no one asked to hear. And their solution was to treat the original not as a sacred text to be copied, but as a thematic seed to be replanted in very different soil. The result is a film that feels like a genuine, if deeply flawed, attempt to engage with what a roadhouse could mean in 2024, rather than a cynical cash grab designed to exploit nostalgia, while offering nothing new in return. And that effort, however imperfectly realized, deserves to be acknowledged. The casting of Jake Gyllenhaal, which was announced to a chorus of skepticism from fans who could not imagine anyone filling Patrick Swayze's boots, turns out in retrospect to have been the only possible choice. The one actor working in Hollywood today who combines the necessary physical credibility with the emotional depth to make this particular version of Dalton work. Gyllenhaal's career, from Donnie Darko to Brokeback Mountain to Nightcrawler to Southpaw, has been defined by a willingness to explore the darkest corners of masculine psychology, to find the vulnerability inside the tough guy and the toughness inside the sensitive soul, a dialectic that this film requires to function at all. His Dalton is not a replacement for Swayze's, any more than a cover of a song is a replacement for the original recording. It is a different performance of the same underlying material, one that reveals new dimensions of the composition, even as it inevitably fails to capture certain qualities of the version we fell in love with first. The presence of actual UFC fighters in supporting roles, a choice that could have been a distracting gimmick, instead contributes to the film's overarching commitment to physical authenticity and to its thematic interest in the porous boundary between sport and real violence. These fighters bring with them not just technical skill, but a kind of embodied knowledge of what it actually feels like to be in a cage with someone trying to hurt you, a knowledge that inflects their performances in subtle but significant ways that trained actors, however committed, cannot easily replicate. The film becomes, in part, a meditation on the UFC itself, its brutal beauty and its ethical complications, the way it transforms primal human violence into entertainment, and the psychological toll that transformation takes on the human beings who perform it for our pleasure. The economic dimensions of the plot, the overt focus on gentrification, real estate development, and the destruction of local businesses by predatory capital, ground the film's more fantastical elements in a recognizable and genuinely infuriating contemporary reality. When Brandt talks about his resort development plans, the language he uses is not the language of a traditional mobster, but the language of a venture capitalist, full of buzzwords about growth and opportunity and revitalization that are indistinguishable from the language used to justify actual displacements happening in actual communities around the world today. This is a villainy that the audience can recognize from their own lives, from the coffee shops and bookstores and music venues that have been replaced by chain stores and luxury condos in their own neighborhoods. And this recognition gives the film's central conflict a social and political charge that the original, for all its charms, never attempted to access. The film's relationship to the concept of masculinity itself is complex and, at times, actively contradictory, simultaneously critiquing the destructive potential of traditional masculine stoicism, while also indulging in extended sequences designed to make audiences cheer for that very same stoicism when it is deployed against acceptable targets. Dalton's journey is, on one level, a journey away from the toxic isolation of the man who cannot ask for help, cannot express emotion, cannot connect with others except through violence. But it is also, on another level, a journey toward a more refined and potent version of that same masculine ideal, a man who has learned to control his monster rather than be controlled by it. The film does not resolve this contradiction so much as hold it up for examination, inviting the audience to sit with the discomfort of wanting to be both the sensitive, healing man and the dominant, violent man without the easy resolution of declaring one mode definitively superior to the other. The reception of Conor McGregor's performance has become, in the months since the film's release, a synecdoche for the broader reception of the film itself, with the same words and phrases appearing in discussions of both. He is ridiculous, he is mesmerizing, he cannot act, he is the best thing in the movie, he is a black hole of charisma, he is a gaping void where a performance should be. The contradictions pile up until they collapse under their own weight, revealing that what McGregor has done is not acting in any traditional sense, but something adjacent to it, a form of being captured by the camera that has its own kind of validity. His knocks exists outside the categories by which we usually judge screen performances, a creature from another dimension of entertainment entirely. And whether that is a feature or a bug depends entirely on what you came to the movie hoping to find. The film's brisk 90-minute runtime, which many have cited as evidence of its narrative thinness and lack of ambition, can also be understood as a deliberate formal choice, a rejection of the bloat that has infected so much contemporary blockbuster cinema in favor of the lean, propulsive pacing of classic B-movies. There is no fat on this film, no subplots that go nowhere, no scenes that overstay their welcome, no indulgences that pad the running time to satisfy some algorithm's idea of how long content should be to maximize engagement. And this economy is its own kind of artistic integrity, even if it comes at the cost of the breathing room that made the original so pleasurable to inhabit. The critical discourse around the film, the endless comparisons to the original, the arguments about what constitutes a good remake and whether such a thing is even possible, the debates about McGregor's acting and Gyllenhaal's commitment and Lyman's direction, all of this is part of the film's meaning now, layered on top of the actual images, and sounds like sediment accumulating on a riverbed. A film that arrives as a remake cannot be understood in isolation from the original that it remakes. The two texts exist in a permanent, inescapable dialogue, each one changing the way the other is seen, and Roadhouse, 2024, will forever be read through the lens of Roadhouse, 1989. Just as the original has now been subtly altered by the existence of its strange, loud, divisive offspring. The decision by Amazon MGM to bypass a traditional theatrical release, a decision that director Doug Liman publicly protested, has significant implications for how the film is experienced and ultimately remembered, implications that go beyond the immediate question of box office returns. A film released directly to streaming enters the world differently than a film released in theaters, becomes part of the domestic flow of content alongside cooking shows and reality competitions and sitcoms, and this context inevitably shapes the expectations and responses of its audience, lowering the stakes, perhaps, but also lowering the barriers to entry, making the film available to millions who would never have bought a ticket, but might click on a thumbnail. The film's visual effects, most notably the CGI crocodile that appears in several key sequences, have been the subject of considerable mockery online, and it is true that the digital creature never quite escapes the uncanny valley to feel fully real or threatening in the way the film needs it to be. However, the crocodile's unreality, its obvious digitalness, can also be read as a deliberate stylistic choice, an embrace of the artificial that aligns the film more with the tradition of the cartoonish action movie than with the gritty realism that its fight scenes otherwise suggest, a tonal inconsistency that is either a flaw or a feature depending on how generous one is feeling toward the film's overall project. The script's approach to dialogue, a mix of tough guy aphorisms, deadpan humor, and moments of genuine, quiet poetry, reflects the film's larger identity as a hybrid creature that cannot decide whether it wants to be a straight-ahead action movie or a self-aware parody of one. Lines that would have been delivered with complete sincerity in the 1989 version are here delivered with a knowing wink, a little ironic distance that protects the film from accusations of taking itself too seriously while also preventing it from ever achieving the unironic emotional power that made the original a cult classic in the first place. A trade-off that the film seems to have considered carefully and accepted as the cost of doing business in a more cynical era. The physical transformation that Jake Gyllenhaal underwent for this role, following a career pattern that has seen him radically alter his body for films like Southpaw and Nightcrawler, represents a level of commitment to the craft of action cinema that demands recognition even from those who ultimately dislike the finished product. The actor's body, displayed in countless shirtless scenes that serve both character and commercial purposes, becomes a special effect in its own right, a monument to discipline and sacrifice that makes the character's physical capabilities feel earned and real, a visual argument for Dalton's dangerousness that does not require dialogue or plot to make its point, operating purely on the primal level of human physical appraisal that all action cinema ultimately depends upon. The portrayal of the local law enforcement as thoroughly, almost casually corrupt, from the sheriff who is literally in Brant's pocket to the deputies who look the other way as crimes are committed in broad daylight, adds a layer of institutional critique to the film's more personal dramas, suggesting that individual heroism, while noble, is insufficient to address systemic rot. Dalton can defeat Knox in a fight, can bring down Brant's operation through sheer physical force, but the film offers no reassurance that the next wealthy developer who comes along will not simply buy off the next sheriff and start the cycle all over again. a pessimism that feels very much of its moment in a culture losing faith in its institutions one scandal at a time. The bar itself, the Roadhouse, is presented less as a character than as a symbol, a floating signifier of community, resilience, and authentic human connection in an era of increasing isolation, digital mediation, and the commodification of every shared experience. Its eventual destruction, reduced to rubble in the climactic battle between Dalton and Knox, is both a physical event and a symbolic one, the literal ground on which the film's community has gathered being torn apart by the very forces that community was formed to resist. A downbeat note that the film's epilogue struggles to resolve into anything resembling hope without fully succeeding. The film's relationship to alcohol, given the bar setting and the title's association with drinking, is notably restrained and responsible compared to the boozy excess that characterized the original, where cold beer was presented as an uncomplicated good and drinking was almost a moral duty. The 2024 version features characters who drink, sometimes heavily, but the camera does not fetishize the alcohol or celebrate intoxication as a virtue, reflecting a broader cultural shift in attitudes toward drinking that makes the original's approach feel like a document from a different civilization entirely. A world where coolers philosophized with a beer in hand, and no one worried about liver damage or addiction, or the slow erosion of health that comes with making alcohol the center of a social life. The film's handling of Dalton's traumatic backstory, the accidental killing of his opponent in the octagon, is carefully calibrated to provide psychological motivation without descending into melodrama or exploitation, treating the death with a gravity that the rest of the film's tone does not always earn, but that Gyllenhaal's performance consistently honors. Flashbacks are used sparingly, glimpses of the fatal blow and Dalton's subsequent breakdown rather than extended, manipulative sequences designed to wring easy tears from the audience, trusting that the actor's haunted presence in the present tense scenes will communicate everything we need to know about what he is running from and toward. The supporting characters who populate the Roadhouse, the bouncers Dalton trains and the waitstaff he protects, and the regulars who treat the bar as a second home, are sketched with an economy that borders on sketchiness, denying the audience the extended hangout time that would make their fates feel consequential. But the actors in these small roles bring enough specificity and warmth to their brief appearances that the outlines of a richer, fuller film are visible in the negative space, around what we are actually shown. This is the tragedy of the film's pacing, the sense that somewhere on the cutting room floor or in an earlier draft of the script, there is a version of this movie that takes its time, that lets these characters breathe, that earns its emotional payoffs rather than simply collecting them. The film's color palette, dominated by the saturated blues of the ocean, the pinks and oranges of the Florida sunsets, and the warm amber glow of the bar's interior lighting, creates a visual environment that is both seductive and slightly unreal, a postcard version of Florida that is constantly being punctured by the ugly, crimson realities of violence. This aesthetic strategy aligns the viewer's experience with Dalton's own disorientation, the sense of being in a beautiful place where terrible things keep happening, a paradise that is secretly a war zone, a vacation destination built on the bones of whatever came before. The film's sound mix during the bar scenes, with live music competing with shouted conversations competing with the ambient noise of glasses clinking and pool balls cracking, does important world-building work even when the camera is focused on a single conversation, reinforcing the sense that the Roadhouse is a living place. Not just a set where scenes happen, but a genuine environment with its own auditory signature that would be recognizable even to a blind listener. When this soundscape is shattered by breaking glass and screams, the contrast is genuinely jarring, a violation not just of the character's safety, but of the sonic identity of the space itself. And the restoration of the normal bar noise in the aftermath of each fight is its own small, satisfying victory. The decision to make Dalton's fighting style explicitly grounded in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and modern mixed martial arts, complete with rear-naked chokes, leg kicks, and ground-and-pound techniques that were unknown to mainstream audiences in 1989, is more than a simple update to the choreography. It represents a fundamental shift in what the film imagines effective violence to look like, moving from the boxing and bar brawling of the original, which was already nostalgic for an even earlier era of American masculinity, to the technical, systematic, almost scientific approach to combat that the UFC has popularized over the past 3 decades, a shift that mirrors the broader evolution of how we understand and consume violence in the culture. The film's epilogue, which shows Dalton giving his fight money to the struggling local bookstore and then boarding a bus alone, has been criticized as unsatisfying and anticlimactic. But it is perhaps the most honest moment in the entire film. A quiet admission that the hero cannot stay, that the community he saved is not his to join, that the violence required to save the day has rendered him unfit for the very peace he fought to preserve. The original Dalton drove off with his girl and a smile, a classic Hollywood ending that suggested closure and happiness. But the 2024 Dalton leaves alone and heading nowhere in particular, a wandering figure whose victory has not healed him. Only bought him another day, another chance, another leg of a road that has no visible end. The sequel set up in the mid-credits scene, revealing Knox alive and presumably vengeful, has the unfortunate effect of retroactively reducing the stakes of the climax we just witnessed, informing us that the brutal, exhausting, apparently fatal violence we watched Dalton inflict was not, in fact, fatal at all. A narrative cheat that feels borrowed from a lesser genre than the one the film has otherwise tried to inhabit. However, the scene also functions as a kind of admission, an acknowledgement that the Knoxes of the world are not so easily killed, that the forces of chaos and cruelty and joyful destruction are resilient in ways that the forces of order and community and restraint can never quite match. A dark thought that lingers long after the streaming interface has already started recommending the next piece of content. Ultimately, Roadhouse 2024 is a film that deserves to be engaged with on its own terms, as an artifact of its specific moment in the evolution of action cinema, the streaming economy, and the ongoing cultural negotiation with the legacy of the 1980s that has defined so much of the past decade's popular entertainment. Its flaws are real and significant. Its pacing is rushed. Its villains outside of Knox are forgettable. Its emotional payoffs are often unearned. And its relationship to the original that spawned it will never satisfy those who wanted a loving, faithful tribute to the movie they remember. But its strengths are also real, anchored by a lead performance of genuine depth and physical commitment, energized by a villain performance that no one who sees the film will ever entirely forget, and structured around a willingness to take genuine risks with a beloved property that most similar projects would have played entirely safe. And for those reasons, it deserves not a dismissal but a conversation, one that this analysis has tried to begin. The architecture of the film's violence is built upon a foundation of genuine martial arts knowledge, with fight coordinator Steve Brown, a veteran of the UFC's early days, bringing a level of technical authenticity that fundamentally distinguishes this iteration from its predecessors' more theatrical brawling. Every submission attempt, every defensive posture, every moment of footwork and head movement speaks to a deep understanding of how actual mixed martial artists operate under extreme duress, a vocabulary of violence that MMA fans will recognize and appreciate while remaining legible to neophytes experiencing these techniques for the first time. The rear naked choke that Dalton applies in one particularly tense sequence is not a movie choke, not a dramatic squeezing of the neck that gives the victim time to gurgle out a final threat, but a technically precise blood choke that renders the recipient unconscious within seconds, a detail that communicates the brutal efficiency that separates a professional from a street brawler. The psychological warfare that Dalton wages against his opponents, often before a single punch is thrown, represents a seldom discussed aspect of combat sports that the film translates effectively to the dramatic register of the narrative. His pre-fight ritual of calmly stating the medical consequences of the violence he is about to inflict, describing in clinical detail the compound fractures, torn ligaments, and permanent disabilities that await his adversaries if they choose to proceed, serves as both a tactical weapon and a thematic statement about his character's relationship to his own capacity for harm. This is not bravado, not the trash talk of the traditional action hero puffing out his chest before the brawl. It is a warning issued by a man who has seen the worst possible outcome of his own skills and is desperately trying to avoid repeating that nightmare, giving every opponent a genuine, almost pleading chance to walk away. The film's depiction of the medical aftermath of violence, facilitated by the presence of Ellie as a love interest, who is also a medical professional, consistently refuses the convenient amnesia that allows most action cinema to ignore the long-term physical costs of the hero's chosen method of conflict resolution. Characters who take significant damage in one scene carry that damage into subsequent scenes, moving gingerly, nursing wounds, experiencing the cumulative physical degradation that actual combat produces, but that genre convention typically elides in favor of keeping the hero camera ready. When Dalton winces while attempting a movement that was effortless 2 scenes earlier, or when a defeated henchman reappears in a cast or on crutches, the film quietly insists that the violence it depicts has consequences, a quiet ethical commitment woven into the fabric of its visual storytelling rather than announced through dialogue. The economic desperation that drives the community of Glass Key, the understanding that Frankie's bar is not merely a business but a lifeline, a source of dignity and income in a region where the alternatives are service jobs at the very resorts that threaten to replace it, connects the film's pulpy thrills to a tradition of social realism that action cinema has often abandoned. When Dalton walks through the town and observes the closed shops, the struggling fishermen, the locals who have been priced out of their own neighborhoods by the influx of wealthy outsiders seeking vacation properties, he is witnessing the slow violence of economic displacement that Brandt's overt criminality merely accelerates. A violence that does not require henchmen because it operates through the perfectly legal mechanisms of predatory real estate development and regulatory capture. The soundtrack's strategic deployment of silence during moments of maximum tension, the sudden absence of music and ambient noise creating a vacuum that the audience's own anxiety rushes in to fill, demonstrates a level of audio craft that elevates the film above its genre peers. In the seconds before Knox launches his first attack on Dalton, the soundscape contracts to almost nothing, just the distant crash of waves and the 2 men's breathing, a pocket of pure anticipation that makes the eventual explosion of violence feel both inevitable and shocking, a technique borrowed from horror cinema that action films often neglect in their rush to maintain a constant level of stimulation. The decision to shoot the Florida Keys as both a paradise and a prison, a place of impossible beauty from which escape is logistically difficult and economically impossible for most of its inhabitants, creates a visual metaphor for the trap that Dalton has built for himself through his own choices and his own uncontrollable nature. The bridges that connect the Keys to the mainland, those slender ribbons of concrete stretching across miles of turquoise water, become symbols of a freedom that is technically available but practically inaccessible, a route out that Dalton will eventually take alone, but that the community he leaves behind cannot follow, bound as they are to a place that is being systematically destroyed. The relationship between Dalton and the bookstore owner, a character who appears in only a handful of scenes, but whose presence carries disproportionate thematic weight, offers a quiet counterpoint to the film's dominant mode of aggressive masculinity, suggesting alternative forms of strength and resistance that do not require physical violence. The bookstore represents everything that Brandt's resort development would erase: the life of the mind, the preservation of culture, the slow, patient work of building community through shared knowledge rather than shared conflict, and Dalton's decision to give his blood money to this particular cause at the film's conclusion is a small but significant gesture of allegiance. A statement about what he actually values despite the violent means he has been forced to employ: the film's engagement. With the mythology of the UFC, the way it simultaneously celebrates and critiques the organization that made Dalton a star and then discarded him when he became inconvenient, mirrors the complex relationship that many actual fight fans have with the sport they love. The Octagon is presented as both a cathedral of human achievement and a coliseum of human exploitation, a place where athletes reach the absolute peak of their physical potential, while also being chewed up and spit out by a corporate machine that views them as disposable content generators. A tension that Gyllenhaal's haunted performance carries in every frame without the script ever needing to state it directly. The geographic specificity of the Florida Keys setting, with its unique ecosystem of mangroves and coral reefs, and its particular history of piracy and smuggling and frontier lawlessness recapitulated in modern form, provides a rich subtext that the film occasionally taps into but never fully exploits, a suggestion of deeper thematic resonances that remain just below the surface. The crocodile that haunts the narrative is not merely a convenient threat, but a living relic from an older Florida, a reminder that the state was once a wild, dangerous place before the developers arrived with their bulldozers and their visions of sanitized paradise, and its continued presence suggests that the wildness cannot be entirely paved over no matter how much concrete is poured. The parallel between Dalton's internal struggle to contain his violent impulses and the community's external struggle to contain the violent encroachment of Brandt's development scheme creates a structural rhyme that gives the film's disparate elements a satisfying, if subtle, thematic coherence. Both Dalton and Glass Key are fighting against forces that threaten to overwhelm and consume them. Both are employing strategies of containment that prove ultimately insufficient, and both are forced by circumstances to make a final, desperate stand that will determine whether they survive or are destroyed, a parallelism that the script wisely trusts the audience to notice without signposting. The scene in which Dalton methodically disables a gang of thugs who have cornered him in a confined space, using the environment itself as a weapon and turning their numerical advantage into a liability, is a set piece that deserves comparison with the best action sequences of the past decade, a miniature masterpiece of spatial geography and cause-and-effect choreography. Every object in the room becomes a potential tool or obstacle. Every movement of every combatant is motivated and legible, and the sequence builds to a conclusion that feels both absolutely inevitable and genuinely surprising. The mark of action direction that has been conceived and executed at the highest level of craft, momentarily transcending the film's overall unevenness to achieve something close to formal perfection. The emotional climax of the film occurs not during the final fight with Knox, but in a quiet moment afterward, when Dalton, bleeding and barely conscious, looks at the destruction around him and seems to realize, perhaps for the first time, that winning has not solved anything, that the monster inside him that he unleashed to survive is still there, still hungry, still waiting. It is a moment of genuine existential despair that Gyllenhaal plays with devastating understatement, his face communicating everything that a lesser film would have put into a monologue, and it is this moment, not the violence that precedes or follows it, that justifies the entire project's existence as a serious engagement with its material rather than a nostalgic exercise. The film's treatment of the original's most famous line, which is referenced obliquely rather than quoted directly, represents a smart compromise between honoring the source material and establishing independence from it, a knowing wink that connects the two versions without chaining the new one to the old one's specific textual legacy. Other callbacks are handled with similar delicacy, present enough to reward attentive fans of the original, but not so prominent as to alienate viewers who have never seen it or to make the new film feel like a cover band going through the motions of someone else's greatest hits. The supporting performance by Arturo Castro as one of Brandt's henchmen, a character who provides both comic relief and a surprising emotional arc, deserves more attention than it has received in the broader critical conversation, as it represents the film's most successful instance of tonal balancing between the absurd and the sincere. His character's journey from generic muscle to someone who recognizes the moral horror of what he has been participating in and attempts, too late, to make a different choice, adds a dimension to the film's world that suggests even its villains exist within a moral universe rather than simply serving as obstacles for the hero to overcome. The film's depiction of police corruption, which escalates from looking the other way to active participation in attempted murder over the course of the narrative, functions as a systemic critique that distinguishes this roadhouse from the more individualistic moral framework of its predecessor, where the villain was bad, but the institutions that were supposed to stop him were merely absent or inept rather than actively complicit. When the sheriff pulls a gun on Dalton, a man who has only ever tried to protect the community that the sheriff has sworn to serve, the betrayal is not merely personal but institutional, a failure of the entire social contract that leaves violence as the only remaining form of justice. The film's color grading during night scenes, which pushes the shadows toward deep blue and the highlights toward amber, creates a visual atmosphere that is simultaneously beautiful and slightly oppressive, a nighttime Florida that feels dangerous and seductive in equal measure. This nocturnal aesthetic dominates the film's second half, as the conflict escalates and the possibility of a happy, sunlit resolution recedes, and the darkness becomes not just a setting but a statement, a visual argument that the world of the film is one in which light and clarity are increasingly scarce resources. The decision to eliminate the original film's famous monster truck, a piece of iconography so closely associated with the Roadhouse brand that its absence feels almost provocative, can be read as a statement of intent, a declaration that this version will not be relying on the nostalgic affection of audiences for the trappings of its predecessor. What the monster truck represented in the original, a kind of cartoonish excess that signaled the film's willingness to embrace its own absurdity, is instead channeled into Knox's wardrobe, or lack thereof, and his increasingly unhinged behavior, a displacement of the surreal from the vehicular to the human that is entirely in keeping with the remake's focus on psychological extremity over physical spectacle. The film's relationship to the concept of redemption is notably ambivalent, refusing to grant Dalton the clean arc of atonement that genre conventions typically demand for heroes who have committed unforgivable acts in their pasts. He does not save the town and find peace, does not forgive himself for the death he caused, does not receive absolution from the family of the man he killed or from the community that has adopted him. He simply survives, continues to exist, gets on a bus and goes somewhere else, and the film leaves open the distinct possibility that survival is the only redemption available to someone like him. A deeply unfashionable but persistently honest perspective that lingers uncomfortably after the credits roll. The cameo appearance by a real-life UFC commentator during the brief flashback sequence that shows Dalton's fatal fight serves to anchor the film's fictional MMA universe in the actual media infrastructure of the sport, a blurring of the line between reality and fiction that lends credibility to the world building without requiring extensive exposition. For viewers familiar with the UFC, this moment of recognition creates an immediate sense of verisimilitude. For viewers who are not, it simply reads as another piece of the background texture, a detail that enriches the world without demanding to be noticed, the mark of thoughtful production design operating at its most invisible and effective. The physics of the film's fight scenes, the way bodies move through space and respond to impact, adheres to a hybrid system that combines the exaggerated, legible kinetics of Hong Kong action cinema with the messy, awkward realities of actual combat, creating a style that is neither fully realistic nor fully fantastical, but exists in a compelling middle ground. When Dalton throws a kick that would be impossible for a normal human, but lands it with an impact that feels sickeningly real, the film is negotiating a contract with its audience, promising spectacle without completely abandoning the grounding that makes that spectacle meaningful, and this negotiation is, for the most part, successfully managed. The film's final image, of Dalton on a bus heading toward an unknown destination, his face a mask of exhaustion and something that might be the beginning of peace or might simply be the absence of the energy required to continue suffering, is a gamble that pays off precisely because it refuses the closure that the preceding 90 minutes have conditioned the audience to expect. He does not look back at the keys receding in the distance, does not smile, does not signal through any conventional cinematic gesture that everything is going to be okay now that the bad guy is dead and the girl has been kissed and the bar has been saved. He just sits and breathes and continues to exist, a man who has survived his own life for another day, and the bus carries him forward into a future that the film, to its great credit, refuses to imagine for us. The film's opening sequence, which introduces Dalton not through dialogue, but through the silent ritual of preparation before an underground fight, immediately establishes a visual language that privileges observation over explanation, trusting the audience to infer character from behavior rather than relying on exposition. We watch him wrap his hands with the methodical precision of a surgeon scrubbing in for a procedure, his movements automatic, practiced, completely devoid of the preening showmanship that the other fighters in the dingy warehouse exhibit as they psyche themselves up for combat, and in those few seconds of wordless screen time. Gyllenhaal communicates volumes about a man who has been doing this so long that fighting has become as mundane and necessary as breathing. The warehouse where these underground bouts take place functions as a descent into a modern underworld, a fluorescent-lit Hades where desperate men trade their physical health for cash while spectators who should know better cheer for the carnage from behind the safety of their cell phone cameras. Capturing content for social media platforms that will strip the context and the consequences from the violence and serve it up as disposable entertainment. Dalton's relationship to this ecosystem is complicated. He despises it, clearly, the way a recovering addict might despise the alley where they once scored their drug, but he also depends on it, needs the money, needs the punishment, needs the ritual of combat to quiet the noise in his head that grows unbearable during the long silences between fights. The contrast between the underground warehouse and the sunlit, pastel-colored world of Glass Key that Dalton enters when he accepts Frankie's offer is so stark that it almost feels like stepping from one genre into another, from a gritty crime drama into a travelogue, a disorientation that mirrors the character's own uncertainty about whether he deserves to be in a place this beautiful, this normal, this removed from the darkness he has come to accept as his natural habitat. The Florida light seems to expose him, to reveal the scars and the damage and the barely contained violence that he could hide in the shadows of the underground, and his first days in Glass Key are marked by a visible discomfort, the awkwardness of a nocturnal animal forced into daylight. The training sequences in which Dalton attempts to transform the ragtag staff of the Roadhouse into a functional security team are compressed into a montage that, while efficient, represents one of the film's missed opportunities, a place where the breathing room of the original was sacrificed on the altar of pacing. What could have been a rich, extended sequence of mentorship and community building? The film's chance to show Dalton connecting with the people he is supposed to protect becomes a series of quick cuts and shouted instructions that convey information, but not feeling technical competence without emotional investment. And the relationships that should have been forged in these moments remain largely theoretical for the rest of the runtime. However, the montage does contain one brilliant, fleeting detail that almost compensates for its brevity. The moment when Dalton, demonstrating a technique, hesitates for a fraction of a second before making contact with his volunteer. A microscopic flinch that reveals the ever-present fear of hurting someone again, of letting the monster out even in a controlled, educational context. This moment, which occupies perhaps 2 seconds of screen time, is pure Gyllenhaal, an actorly choice that adds a layer of psychological complexity to what could have been a generic training sequence, reminding the audience that every act of violence this man commits, even instructional violence, carries the weight of the one act of violence that destroyed his life. The film's treatment of the ocean as both a literal setting and a metaphorical presence deserves sustained attention, as water imagery pervades the film from its opening aerial shots of the Keys to the climactic battle on a boat, creating a visual motif that speaks to themes of submersion, purification, and the dangerous depths that lie beneath calm surfaces. Dalton arrives by water, crossing a bridge that spans the turquoise expanse like a needle threading 2 pieces of fabric together, and his journey throughout the film is consistently associated with liminal waterfront spaces, docks and beaches and the decks of boats, suggesting a character who exists between worlds, never fully at home on solid ground. The aquatic symbolism reaches its apotheosis in the sequence where Dalton, having been ambushed and left for dead, must literally drag himself out of the ocean, a baptismal rebirth that strips him of his remaining illusions and sends him back to Glass Key with nothing left to lose. The image of Gyllenhaal emerging from the water, gasping, wounded, his eyes blazing with a new, terrible resolve, is the film's most overt mythological gesture, a direct invocation of the hero's journey that the original film, for all its charms, never attempted with such self-conscious grandeur, and it works despite its obviousness because the actor commits to it so completely. The film's engagement with class dynamics, while not its primary concern, surfaces repeatedly in ways that enrich the central conflict beyond the simple framework of good versus evil, suggesting that what is at stake in the battle for the Roadhouse is not just one bar, but an entire way of life that is being systematically erased by the accumulation of wealth at the top. The patrons of the bar are not glamorous. They are fishermen and waitresses and construction workers, people whose labor makes the Florida Keys function, but who cannot afford to live in the world that Brandt's resort development promises to create, a world of luxury condos and exclusive marinas that has no place for the people who actually built and maintain the paradise it sells to outsiders. This economic subtext finds its most pointed expression in a brief but devastating exchange between Frankie and one of her regular customers, an older fisherman who mentions that his family has been working these waters for 3 generations, but that his children have all moved north because there is no future for them in the Keys anymore. The line is delivered almost as an aside, a piece of local color, but its implications ripple outward through the rest of the film, transforming the bar from a simple setting for action sequences into a symbol of resistance against a process of economic cleansing that is happening in coastal communities all over the world, a process that Brandt merely accelerates rather than initiates. The portrayal of Knox as a man who treats violence as not just a profession but a vocation, a sacred calling, that he has pursued with the devotion of a monk and the creativity of an artist, elevates him from a simple antagonist into something approaching a dark mirror of Dalton's own relationship to combat. Where Dalton fights because he has to, because fighting is the only language he speaks fluently and the only currency he possesses, Knox fights because he wants to, because fighting is the only activity that makes him feel truly alive, and this distinction, which seems small on the surface, opens into a chasm of philosophical difference that gives their final confrontation genuine dramatic weight beyond the physical spectacle. McGregor's physical performance, which has been alternately celebrated and mocked, achieves something genuinely unusual in action cinema. A fighting style that is simultaneously technically proficient and aesthetically chaotic, a whirlwind of spinning attacks and unpredictable angles that looks less like choreography and more like genuine improvisation, because in many ways it is. The choreographers wisely chose to build the fights around McGregor's actual repertoire of techniques, the spinning back elbows and flying knees and unorthodox entries that made him a two-division UFC champion, rather than forcing him to learn a completely foreign physical vocabulary. And the result is a performance that feels alive and dangerous in ways that more polished, more practiced fight scenes rarely achieve. The film's approach to Dalton's drinking, or rather his conspicuous lack of drinking, represents a subtle but significant departure from the original's boozy romanticism, a choice that aligns the character with contemporary values around health and self-control while also serving a narrative function. Dalton does not drink because he cannot afford to lose even a fraction of the control he exercises over himself at every waking moment, because the monster inside him is kept at bay by a discipline so total that it extends to every aspect of his physical existence, from his diet to his sleep schedule to his refusal of any substance that might lower his guard. And this abstemiousness, while never directly commented upon, tells its own story about a man living in constant fear of his own worst impulses. The sheriff character, played by Joaquim de Almeida with a weariness that suggests decades of moral compromise slowly calcifying into something like resignation, represents the institutional failure that the film positions as arguably more dangerous than the individual villainy of Brandt. He is not a cackling monster, but a tired, compromised man who made a deal with the devil so long ago that he can no longer remember what it felt like to have clean hands. And his eventual confrontation with his daughter Ellie forces him to reckon with the cost of his corruption in terms that are painfully personal rather than abstract, a reckoning that the film handles with surprising restraint and genuine emotional impact. The scene in which Ellie confronts her father, holding his own service weapon on him while Dalton bleeds on the floor of the sheriff's station, is the dramatic high point of the film's non-action sequences, a chamber piece of familial betrayal and moral awakening that Melchior and de Almeida play with a rawness that feels earned rather than manufactured. The dialogue is spare, almost terse, a family argument compressed into the space of a few desperate sentences. But the history between these characters, the years of unspoken compromises and uneasy silences, and the slow dawning horror of a daughter realizing who her father actually is, fills the space between the words with a density that the script's more functional passages only occasionally achieve. The sound design of the fights, which we have already noted for its visceral realism, takes on an additional dimension during the final confrontation, where the noise of the battle is intercut with the distant sound of the ocean, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pulse that continues regardless of the human drama unfolding on the shore. This sonic choice has a strange, calming effect, a reminder that the world is vastly larger than the conflict that feels, to the characters and the audience, like the only thing that matters, and it contributes to the elegiac tone of the climax. The sense that what we are watching is not a triumph, but a tragedy playing out against an indifferent natural backdrop that will still be there, beautiful and unmoved, long after the combatants have destroyed each other. The film's handling of the crocodile, which we have discussed as a symbolic element, also functions on a purely practical level as a Chekhov's gun that the film loads in its first act and fires in its third, a narrative efficiency that, while perhaps too neat, demonstrates a respect for the audience's attention that is not always present in streaming-era action films. When the crocodile reappears at a crucial moment, it feels neither random nor contrived but like the fulfillment of a promise the film made early on, a piece of the environment that was always going to play a role in the resolution because the environment itself is a character in this story, the Florida wilderness asserting its ancient claim on the land that the human characters are fighting over. The film's color psychology, the deliberate association of warm amber and gold tones with the interior of the roadhouse and cool blues and greens with the world outside, creates a chromatic argument for the bar as a place of safety and human warmth in a hostile, indifferent universe. When characters are inside the bar, they are bathed in light that makes them look alive, present, connected to each other. When they leave, especially at night, they enter a world of cold, alienating color that seems to drain the humanity from their faces, a visual cue that the audience registers subconsciously even if they never consciously articulate it. The editing rhythm of the film, which accelerates during action sequences to a pace that some viewers find disorienting and others find exhilarating, is clearly calibrated for the small screens on which most audiences will experience it, a concession to the realities of streaming distribution that the theatrical experience would have rendered differently. The rapid cutting, the constant motion, the avoidance of long takes that would allow the eye to settle and the mind to wander, These are techniques designed to hold the attention of a viewer who might otherwise be tempted to check their phone. And they succeed on those terms even as they sacrifice the compositional elegance that a more patient editing style might have achieved. The film's wardrobe choices for Gyllenhaal, which consistently clothe him in simple, functional garments that emphasize his physicality without calling attention to themselves, participate in the construction of a character who has no interest in style, no vanity, no desire to be looked at except perhaps as a warning. The contrast with Knox, whose wardrobe runs the gamut from garish to non-existent, could not be more pronounced, and this sartorial opposition reinforces the central philosophical conflict between a man who wants to disappear into his environment and a man who wants to dominate every environment he enters with the sheer force of his presence. The decision to set the film's climactic action not in the bar but on a boat and the surrounding water, a departure from the original that further emphasizes the remake's commitment to finding its own visual language, is a risk that pays off in terms of spectacle even as it sacrifices the symbolic resonance of the bar itself being the site of the final confrontation. The boat explosion that marks the beginning of the end is a genuinely impressive piece of practical and digital effects work, a fireball reflected in the dark water that provides the film with its most iconic image, and the subsequent fight on the beach and in the shallows uses the unstable, shifting ground of wet sand to add an element of physical unpredictability to the choreography. The supporting character of the teenage girl who works at the bookstore, a character so minor she does not even have a name in the credits, nonetheless serves an important function as a representative of the future that Dalton is fighting for, the next generation that might be able to live in Glass Key if the forces of development can be beaten back. Her brief scene with Dalton, in which he awkwardly tries to make conversation about a book he has clearly never read, is one of the few moments in the film where the character seems genuinely out of his depth. Not because he is facing a physical threat, but because he is facing the normalcy that he has been exiled from, the simple human interaction that his life of violence has rendered foreign to him. The road of the title, which was a literal highway in the original film, becomes in this version something more abstract, a journey rather than a destination, the long and uncertain path that a traumatized person must travel to find something resembling peace, a journey that the film acknowledges may never be completed. The final shot of the highway stretching out ahead of the bus that carries Dalton away from Glass Key is both a callback to the original and a declaration of difference, a visual statement that this road does not end in a sunset with a smiling hero and his adoring girlfriend, but continues indefinitely into a future that is unknown and perhaps unknowable. The film's engagement with the concept of home, what it means to have one, what it means to lose one, what it means to fight for one, runs beneath the surface of every scene set in the Roadhouse, a bar that functions as a home for people who may not have another, a gathering place for a community that is itself under threat of displacement. When Dalton defends the bar, he is not just defending a business or even a community, but the very idea that some spaces should exist outside the logic of the market, that there should be places where people gather not to spend money, but to be together. And this idea, while never directly articulated, gives the violence a moral dimension that it would otherwise lack. The film's release strategy, the controversial decision to bypass theaters despite the director's objections, has implications for how the action sequences are experienced that are worth considering in any comprehensive analysis, as the compression of streaming audio and the limitations of home viewing necessarily diminish the impact of the sound design and the visual spectacle. The film was designed for a theatrical experience, shot in a widescreen aspect ratio, and mixed for a surround sound environment that most home viewers will never experience, and while the compensation techniques employed by the editors, faster cutting and louder overall volume, mitigate some of this loss, they cannot fully replace the communal, immersive experience that the director intended. The legacy of the original Roadhouse, a film that was itself a critical failure upon release and only grew into its cult status over decades of late-night cable screenings and VHS rentals, haunts this new version in ways that are both productive and limiting. A reminder that the cultural meaning of a text is not fixed at the moment of its creation, but evolves over time through the accumulated responses of its audience. The 2024 version may be judged harshly now, dismissed as a pale imitation or a misguided update, but the history of the original suggests that these judgments are provisional, that the audiences of the future may find in this film something that the audiences of the present cannot yet see, a possibility that should humble any critic who claims to deliver a definitive verdict. The film's existential core, The question that Dalton carries with him like a splinter under his skin is whether a person who has done something unforgivable can ever become someone worthy of forgiveness, or whether the past is an unchangeable fact that must simply be endured, carried forward like a stone in the shoe that can never be removed, only accommodated. The original Dalton had a past that was mysterious but not traumatic, a legend that preceded him but did not haunt him. The new Dalton has a past that is a wound that will not heal, a ghost that will not rest, a voice in his head that will not stop reminding him of what he did and what he is capable of doing again. And it is this wound, this haunting, this voice, that makes him a fundamentally different character, inhabiting the same name and the same job description, but a completely different emotional universe. The final, lingering question that Roadhouse 2024 leaves in the mind of the attentive viewer is not whether it is better or worse than the original, a comparison that the film itself seems to find irrelevant to its own concerns, but whether it succeeds in telling its own story on its own terms, a story about violence and trauma and the long, hard road towards something that might, if one is very lucky and very stubborn, eventually resemble peace. The answer, like the road itself, is ambiguous, winding, not easily mapped, and this ambiguity, far from being a failure, is perhaps the most honest thing about the entire project, a refusal to pretend that the questions it raises have simple answers or that the journey it depicts has a definite end.